Det är torsdagen den 22 januari. Jag heter Andreas Ericson och du lyssnar på Ledarredaktionen, en podd från Svenska Dagbladet. Varmt välkomna ska ni vara till oss igen. Idag ska vi ta oss an minst sagt stora frågor. Hur ska vi egentligen prioritera världens resurser för att lösa de mest omfattande problemen vi har när det gäller exempelvis svält, undernäring, sjukdomar, brist på utbildning och så vidare? För att inte tala om de miljöproblem som exempelvis den globala uppvärmningen skapar. Vilka åtgärder är det som är effektiva? Vilka är det som ger mest, givet vilka resurser man satsar? Och tvärtom, vilka är det som inte gör någon nytta alls, trots att de kanske är väldigt dyra? Det ska vi prata om idag, och det ska vi göra med hjälp av en person som ni som har följt med Svenska Dagbladets ledarredaktion känner väl till. Han har varit en återkommande gästskribent i många år och heter Bjørn Lomborg och kommer från Copenhagen Consensus Center. Welcome to ledarredaktionen, Bjørn.
Många tack.
Nice to have you on the podcast. First of all, I like to quote one of your famous countrymen, H.C. Andersen. In the preface to a Swedish translation of one of his books, he wrote, and I quote, "Jag håller icke av att danske bö översättes på svensk, icke heller att svenske förs över i vårt språk. Vi nabor kunne och skulle läsa hinande i originalet, men det visar sig att detta ännu icke på går, så översättelse är nödvändiga för många." And this is unfortunately still the case, so we're going to have this conversation in English. That's fine with you?
It's fine with me, and congrats on your Danish.
Thank you. Thank to H.C. Andersen. I'd like to start with your latest piece in Svenska Dagbladet. You wrote it in December about the UN Sustainability Development Goals. Their deadlines is pretty close now, 2013. How are we doing with these goals?
Not very well.
Okay.
And in some ways, it really tells a very important story. So back in 2015, we did these goals. So Sweden signed up, Denmark signed up, every country in the world. I don't think North Korea did, but virtually every country in the world signed up to do everything for everyone, everywhere, all the time, and anything you can possibly imagine. So we promised to get rid of poverty, get rid of hunger, get rid of disease, pretty much, and get rid of air pollution and climate change and war and all other good things in the world. And it's very well intentioned, but we can't actually deliver on all these things. When you promise everything, you'll eventually end up making a lot of people feel really let down. So what we did was we promised way too much, and we didn't give a thought about what can we do at realistic costs and what can we do first. If we can't do everything, we really should have a conversation about where should we start, what should we do first.
Okay. Just a piece of background. There were earlier UN goals, the Millennium Goals,
yes.
And we did quite well, didn't we?
We did a lot better, and it's a cautionary tale. So in 2000, the UN did the Millennium Development Goals, and in reality, it was just really 7 goals, and they were all very simple. Get people out of poverty. So it was more than half the global population of poverty. Get moms and kids to not die. Get people out of starvation. Get more trees or less forest deforestation, and a few others. Get all kids into schools. So these were very simple things, and surprisingly and quite encouragingly, we managed to do a lot of them. We didn't manage to do all of them, but we really got a far way. And the reason is we picked a few goals, and we picked really smart goals, meaning goals that are fairly cheap to do and that are obvious that we need to do first. So instead of promising everything to everyone, we promised a few very specific things, and we actually managed to do a lot of it. That's what we should have done in 2015, and of course that's why we're failing badly here in 2026.
So simply put, we overreached.
Yes. And it's not surprising if you ask everyone, what do you want to do? And there's no sort of budgetary limit. You obviously want to say, well, we should do all good things. And that was essentially what happened. So this was set by about 80 UN ambassadors in New York over a period of about a year. And I went to meet with a lot of them, about a third of them individually in New York. And I tried to tell them, please don't promise promise everything to everyone. But of course, their goal was just to put in as many nice words in the document. It's a really long and very boring document. But the reality is when you promise everything to everyone, you will fail.
And right now we are on the schedule, on the timetable, with about 20% of them, I think.
Yes.
And there are some who is stagnant, and some are moving backwards, actually. Yes.
So look, there is one measure of how well we're doing, and it's very, very hard to do because it's so many different targets. But it seems to indicate that right now we're going to be 50 years late. We're going to be done in 2089 instead of 2030. So yeah, we're a little behind.
Okay. And one of your main argument is that we need to get our priorities right. We have to, given the limited resources, where can every penny do the most good?
Yes.
And what is the answer to that? How when it comes to a cost-benefit analysis?
So I actually just gave you a book that gives you that,
You did, yes.
that answer.
I have it in my hand.
And yes, so we worked together with more than 100 economists, world's top economists, and several Nobel laureates to try to figure out, of all the things we promised, which ones can you spend a kroner, or more realistically, a couple 100 million kroner, and do the most good for every krona spent? And this should be an obvious thing, right? I mean, we do this all the time in our private lives. I don't know your life, but I'm assuming that your kids want a new bike, and you also want to go on a vacation, and maybe the roof is leaking, and there's all kinds of things, and you always have to make hard choices with your limited resources. Again, I'm assuming you're not a billionaire.
No, I'm not.
Yes.
As listeners are.
So we have to make tough choices. And so we look at how much is the benefit, how much is this going to cost, and we make sort of a fairly simple equation of where can I get the most bang for my kroner.
And this is also what we teach our kids. If you want a new bike, you want new Pokemon cards, whatever, well, do an analysis, cost-benefit analysis.
And so that was what we did in this book. So we ended up finding, so we somewhat arbitrarily, but this is set by our Nobels at one point, we said, all right, let's look for all the things that deliver at least 15 kroners of wealth or of social good back on every krona. That's a fantastic payback. Remember, this is not something you can get rich of. This is not mostly financial benefits. So we both look at the financial benefits, but we also look at the environmental benefits and the social benefits, people not dying, for instance. But those are the very, very best things we could do. And we identified 12 of these things. So just let me give you a few examples from the book and from the analysis. It tells you, for instance, we could do an enormous amount of good for maternal and newborn health. So one of the things we don't think about here in the rich world is the most dangerous day in a woman's life in most of the world is the day she gives birth. That's just crazy. I mean, it used to be like that here, but it's no longer because we know how to deal with this. How do you fix it? Well, we actually have a very cheap way of fixing most of it. You need to get the woman into a facility because, if most births go fine, but if they go wrong, they often go dramatically wrong. And so you need to be in an institution so you can handle this. And if you're there, you also need to have very simple things like clean water, antiseptics. You need to have a resuscitator if the child can't breathe. It actually turns out that even here in Europe, about 5% of all kids don't breathe, and they need positive air pressure, a little balloon essentially into their lungs. It's a very simple procedure, but if you don't have it, the kid will die. What we find is this is a very simple thing, very cheap thing to do too, that the World Health Organization estimate everyone should do. If we could go from about 2/3 of all women going into institutions to 90%, and these institutions were slightly better equipped. We're not talking about fancy hospitals. We're just talking about slightly better. We estimate for about $3 billion a year. So not nothing, not something you or I have, but a very small amount of money in the international setting. For $3 billion a year, we could save 166,000 moms from dying each year. That's more than half of all the moms who die every year. And we could save 1.2 million kids. This is just one of the best things we could do. We estimate for every krona spent, you could do 87 kronas worth of good. And this is just one of these 12 things. So we look at education, for instance, where you can do very simple and effective things that for fairly little money deliver much better educated kids. We can perhaps talk about that. We can talk about tuberculosis, malaria, obvious diseases to tackle, vaccinations. But it's also something about making sure that people have more opportunity in poor worlds, like land tenure reform. So for most people, they work in agriculture, and many don't know if they actually own the land because there's not good land registration. About 1 billion people on the planet believe that in the next 5 years they're going to be evicted from their land. If you think that, you're not going to dig a well or make irrigation or plant orchards so that the trees will only bloom and give fruit in 5 or 10 years. You will just do what you can for the next year.
Right. In Swedish we would call this lågt hängande frukt.
Yes, exactly. Low-hanging fruit. Yeah.
Why isn't it being done already then?
The short answer is a little bit is being done, but it's because we're back to this, we want to do everything. So when you talk to a lot of politicians, they like to say, I want to do all good things, right? Because that makes it sound like they're doing more. So they will say, I want to do something that will help women. But I also want to help rural women. I also want to help those with children. And maybe we want to make sure that these are indigenous people. And maybe we want to make sure that they're illiterate. You put up all these boxes and you tick all these different things. And then you end up doing something that sounds good and that looks good in a press release, but it's not very effective. When you say, for instance, as I just mentioned, we need what the World Health Organization call BMONC, so basic emergency obstetric and newborn care, in hospitals and get women into institutions to give birth. That doesn't sound very sexy, and it's just one thing. So you want to tick a lot of boxes. You want to get a lot of news releases out. And so you end up doing a little bit of everything, just like the Sustainable Development Goals did.
Yeah, right. And on the other end of the spectrum, are there things being done today that are expensive but not very good, really, when you examine them?
Oh, we do a lot of things that are just somewhat good. I'm sure we also do things that are really, really bad, but we don't look at those. So we typically look at the stuff that is, reasonably good. So we find there's a lot of things you can do that deliver, say, 2, 3, 4 kronas back on the krona. Now, that's a nice thing. And I'm glad we're doing that. One obvious thing that we've had a lot of conversations also with the Indians about is water and sanitation. So, a lot of people will say this is one of the most important things to do because obviously if you don't have water, you die. But this, of course, is also why everybody who's alive in the world actually do have water. So when you talk about getting more water, it's much more about getting more convenient water. So this is, and I'm not belittling this, it's very important to be able to get water because it means that especially women, especially girls, don't have to walk a long way to carry this water back home so that mom and dad can use it. But again, if we look at the cost, especially, for instance, if you look at sanitation, which ends up being very expensive, you want to keep it, you end up with benefit cost ratios of about 3. So for every krona spent, you'll do 3 kronas of good. And a lot of these are not done well. So you'll just dig a pit latrine to tell the authorities and maybe tell the Swedish authorities as well, we've done something for sanitation, so you've got a check mark, but then it's never used because it smells terrible, it's not being emptied frequently enough, and so on. So there's a lot of ways that things don't do all that much good. Again, I'm not saying I'm glad we live in a world where there's also people who are doing this, but I'm simply saying when we don't have enough resources to do all good things, perhaps we should focus on doing the incredibly good things first.
How familiar are you with the policies of foreign aid in Sweden? I was wondering, are we doing good right now?
So I actually live in Sweden. I live in southern Sweden, right on the other side of Copenhagen. So I know some of it.
If you had the Minister for Foreign Aid, Benjamin Dosa, here in the studio, what would you give him for advice?
Well, I actually had the pleasure of meeting him last year, and I gave him the book, and he really liked the idea. But remember, he's also a politician.
Yeah.
So you
gave him the short version.
I gave him both the short and the long version, but I'm pretty sure that the short version was more popular.
Björn gave me one book and one small leaflet, so even the politicians can read it.
Exactly, or at least they're more likely to get a glance of it. And he really likes the idea of doing effective policies. He very clearly instructed SIDA to spend their money more effectively. But of course, there's also all these other pushes, and we get this across both Europe and Canada and Australia and New Zealand, so pretty much all rich countries, unless you're Trump, where you just destroy everything, right? But even in other countries like Norway and others, we also spend a lot of money on Ukraine. We spend a lot of money on refugees. So the money that actually go to poor people is somewhat restricted. And then within that, we end up doing a lot of different things. And so I think Benjamin Dusa has his heart at the right place, but I'm not sure he has quite managed to sort of get all of this back in order. And again, this is why that's one of the reasons why we're having this conversation. We need to make it more politically palatable to not say, I want to do everything, but to say, I just want to do a few things really, really well.
This problem with bad priorities and overreach, has it been better or worse during time?
So I think we've always had this problem. I mean, look, politicians and politics is not predominantly about doing good. It's about getting reelected. And what gets you reelected is not necessarily what works really well. That's true even in Sweden, but it's obviously much more true when we talk about development aid because there's no obvious feedback. We don't know the people that SIDA is helping because they're far, far away. So in a sense, we rely on stories from you and other journalists who tell us, oh, this was a really good thing because, that now this person or that person lives. Look, pretty much all the money that we spend will end up doing some good, which is great. I'm simply making the argument we should spend money where not only it'll do a little good, but it'll do a massive amount of good. And that is a much harder argument. So I think we've always been bad at doing this, and I think we constantly need someone like me to keep saying, let's do better.
Can we always trust the cost-benefit analysis? I mean, the obvious objection would be that there are certain values that can't be measured in kronor or dollars, some humanitarian, as you know the argument. Yeah. What do you think about that?
So, first of all, this is an imprecise science, obviously. We don't know a lot of things. We don't know exactly what will be used and how it will be used. So when I tell you that sanitation give you $3 back in the dollar or 3 kronas back in the kroner, or maternal and newborn health gives us 87 kronas back in the kroner, it's a rough estimate. I would probably estimate it's right within a factor of 2 or something. But it's a pretty good estimate. But the other part of the question that you had, are there things that are not in there? Absolutely. So look, we take into account all the cost and all the benefits. So this is not just a financial analysis. This is also about social and environmental costs. So we try to take in all of these costs. But remember, this is not the only thing that humanity wants. We also, for instance, want equality, or we want, as you mentioned, human rights. These are things that are not in the cost-benefit analysis. So in a sense, if you will, we're the guys who give society a menu, but a menu with prices and sizes. We give you a sense of, if you spend money here, you'll get this much good, and it'll cost you this much. But whether you want to do that is obviously a political question. This is not economists saying that's how the world should be, but it's helping politicians and voters to make better decisions. But again, I would imagine that when we talk about equality, these policies that we're advocating are typically policies that help the very weakest, the very poorest. For instance, when we talk about tuberculosis, one of the reasons why tuberculosis has not been fixed is because it mostly hit very poor people. So people in slum areas, people in prisons, people in migrant communities and mining, that kind of thing. People who are outside much of polite society. And so they often don't vote, and therefore they don't get any health care. We can help deal with that. But that's exactly helping with equality as well. So it's very likely that much of this overlaps, just like when we talk about maternal and newborn health. The moms who don't go to institutions, the moms whose kids die in their first 30 days are very likely not the richest, but the poorest of the people. So again, I think a lot of these overlap, but it's not a precise overlap. So yes, there are other things to look at. But again, when you're confronted with a policy that does 3 kronas back and one that does 87 kronas back, there's a lot to, there's a lot of leeway to make sure that you do the very best.
What are your hopes for the future? Are the politicians starting to get this? Are they more down your alley now than, say, 10 years ago?
I think so. I mean, obviously, 10 years ago or 11 years ago, all the politicians decided we're going to promise everything to everyone, which didn't work. And we knew already back then it wouldn't work. But I think a lot more people are realizing, oh, wait, this doesn't work. I think a lot of politicians were hoping if we promise, the stars, everyone will want to give more development aid. But of course, that's exactly the opposite of what happened. We've been very stingy for quite a while. And now with Trump, but also the UK, Germany, France, even Norway in some sense, and also Sweden, somewhat cutting. Often it's sort of below the surface. We're realizing we have to do better because we have less and less resources. We really have to do the most good we can with every krona. So I think there's a lot more interest. Again, my hope is that we get better at doing this. I would love for us to just do the very most effective things. That'll never happen because that's not how politics work. But if we can push people to spend smarter, that'd be great.
Come to 2030 and we get the result back and see that maybe just a fifth or a fourth of the goals has been met. What would be the effect of that, do you think? Would we be, what would you say? I forgot the word, but really sad about
better. Okay, should we be happy or sad? Yeah. I think one of the things I've been constantly arguing, and I think there's a lot of good data for, is the world is mostly a place that gets better and better. We have a tendency, remember, when we read Svenska Dagbladet or any other news outlet in the world, you guys are put in the world to basically give us a collection of all the worst things that happened in the last 24 hours.
That's my job.
Yeah, that's your job. And so we get a sense that everything is coming apart, but we often forget the long-term trends show us things are getting better and better. We have lifted way over 1 billion people out of poverty in the last 25 years. Actually, every day, every 24 hours, Svenska Dagbladet and every other newspaper in the world could have had as their headline, 138,000 people were lifted out of extreme poverty every day for 25 years. We don't hear this, but we need to remember, overall, fewer people die, fewer kids die. We have much better education. We have much better opportunity in many different ways, and we've lifted, as I said, many people out of poverty. But so come 2030, mostly we'll be better off. But the real depressing outcome is we could have been even better off. We could have had even fewer kids dying. We could have even fewer people in extreme poverty and so on. And so the real loss is we could have done better. And of course, that means that by 2030, we should certainly make sure we don't make the same mistake and promise for 2045 that we're going to do all these things again. But much more importantly, this is 2026. We should do an incredible amount of good this year and next year, not wait till 2030.
Another question. Hasn't the progress slowed down a bit since about 2020?
Yes.
And why is that?
A lot of reasons. Much of the COVID problems hit the developing world a lot. We were very, very worried in the rich world, and we could afford to be that. A lot of countries, not Sweden, to its credit, but a lot of countries decided to shut down almost entirely in order to preserve and safeguard really old people, which is a conversation that has been ongoing. Was that the right decision? But at least in a very rich country where you have lots of old people, that makes some sense. But unfortunately, most of the poor countries in the world have very few old people and don't and can't afford to shut down. Yet they still shut down. They also shut down their schools. And that means that a lot of kids got behind. The World Bank actually estimate this will cost more than $1.2 trillion per year come 2040, in the sense that school kids are going to be less well off. They're going to be less well educated. This is terrible, and we need to go back and try to redo that. And one of the things, of course, is, as we talk about, there are some very smart ways to dramatically increase the efficiency of school. We don't do that so much. It's about getting structured teacher plans, and it's about getting kids taught at their right level. So each for individual level. You could do that, for instance, with a laptop with educational software, a tablet with educational software. These are very simple things. We should go in and make sure we do much more of that. That's one way of getting the world out of the rut, so to speak. But look, we're not going to be able to manage all of it, and certainly Sweden is not going to manage to do all of it. But if we start that conversation, so I'm actually here for the goalkeepers, Bill Gates, later today in Stockholm, and one of the things he's pushing for is exactly some of these incredibly effective things. And so I would love us to do more on the really effective things. And I think Sweden could be a country leading that charge in the world. We're not going to fix everything, but we are going to fix some of the most important things.
Mm. And back to my original question, COVID was a major setback.
Yeah.
Okay. You mentioned Bill Gates. In November last year, the world leaders met in Brazil for yet another climate summit. Prior to this summit, you wrote in Svenska Dagbladet that world leaders ought to be listening more to Bill Gates. What was his message, and why was he right?
So for a very long time, we've been very worried about climate change. So there's been this dominant sort of narrative that the world is ending unless we're going to do a lot against climate change. And that has never been true. Climate change is a real problem. It's a man-made problem, but it's not the end of the world. It's a problem, along with many, many other problems we need to fix in the 21st century. And what Bill Gates said, and what I thought was really incredibly clever way of putting it, was we should not be talking in Belém in Brazil or any other climate summit, or really any other policy at all, about targets. We shouldn't be talking about, net zero by 2050 or 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees. We should be talking about what will be the impact on human welfare of all these policies. Because what that tells you is what will be the actual outcome of all of these things. And one of the things that have dogged the climate policy for a very long time is we end up making very expensive promises. Remember, if all the rich countries went net zero by 2050, which is what almost all rich countries except the US wants to do, this would cost literally hundreds of trillions of dollars over the century. But it would have no impact today. It would have a tiny impact by 2050, and it would reduce temperatures, probably if you run this in the UN climate model, about 0.1 degree by the end of the century. So you almost wouldn't be able to measure it. Spending that much money now in helping people very little in 100 years is not a very good deal. We estimate the average payback on that is for every kroner you spend, you do about 17 euro of good, which is really a bad. I mean, you could just have given the money away and you would have done 7 times better. But the point here is that if you start saying, well, how can we help people better? How can we make human welfare better? If you think about a poor mom in a poor world who has her kids, they might die from easily curable infectious diseases tonight, from malaria, for instance. They don't have enough food. They have terrible education. There are all these kinds of issues. Her primary priority is not for you and me to help reduce temperatures in 100 years by 0.1 degree. That's not her primary priority. It is obviously to fix malaria, fix tuberculosis, fix nutrition, fix education. These are the very simple things. And remember, if we do that, if we get people out of disease, out of hunger, into good education, out of poverty, not only will those be good things in and of themselves, it will also mean they will be much more resilient to anything climate will throw at them. So again, what Bill was really saying is, if you stop doing, thinking this is the end of the world, but start realizing, yeah, it's a problem, along with many other problems. What we're doing on climate will do comparatively little compared to all the other things we could do that would help much more now and of course also help much more in the future, because if you take this mom's kids out of poverty and disease, they will grow up, get their own kids, and be much better off, and be much better able to make sure that their kids get even better off. So by 2100, they will live in a much better world. And that, I think, is one of the big teachings that we need to take away. We need to stop being so preoccupied with climate that we forget about all the other problems in the world. This does not mean, I mean, we're a smart civilization. We can walk and chew gum. We can do several things at once. But we should spend less money more smartly on climate, and we should spend the money that we want to help with the poor world much more smartly, so we actually end up helping them a lot.
And the same question again, the politicians that met in Brazil and will meet this year as well, have they started to listening to Bill Gates and to you?
Well, first of all, the people who are going to meet, who met in Belém and are going to meet in, I think, Turkey, or I can't quite figure out because there are two countries that wanted to run this, but that are going to meet in another nice place in a little year. They're all obviously all climate people. So, not
Which
surprising. Well, if you ask a climate person what's the biggest problem, they'll obviously say climate. If you ask a health person what's the biggest problem, they'll obviously say health. It's our job as voters, and it's the politicians' job as politicians to say, okay, but I get that all of you want the money for yourself, but we have to make the hard calls of saying, where do our money go to? So if you want to fix climate change, what you need to understand is this is not about virtue signaling in the rich world. Whatever the rich world does is a tiny bit in the 21st century emissions. We're going to be about 13%. Realistically, we can cut about 5 of those percent by 2050. So we can do nothing. What really matters is, can we get China, India, Africa, Brazil, Indonesia on board? And we can't unless we make green energy cheaper than fossil fuels. So what we really need to do is to focus on innovation in green energy. And just to give you one example, if we could make 4th generation nuclear or fusion, if we could make fusion work, if we could make it cheaper than fossil fuels, everyone would switch. You wouldn't have to have a conversation. You wouldn't have to meet at all these UN summits because the economics would have made it cheaper. That's the way you solve big problems, through innovation. And we have spent much, much less on innovation than what we promised. We've actually stayed pretty much at the same level for the last 20 years. We've gone down dramatically from the 1980s because we've been so focused on doing virtue signaling. So Swedish, Danish, pretty much all well-meaning rich world people will have put up lots of wind turbines and solar panels and say, see, rather than investing in green energy R&D, which is the way that you're actually going to get this solved.
That's quite surprising, because I thought that green innovation got all the funding it needed, but the numbers says otherwise.
So what you have to remember is we spend a lot of money on stuff we know doesn't work. So the stuff that we actually have to have subsidies and have special regulations. So we spend a lot of money on existing wind turbines and existing solar panels. But the reality is we need to get much better, that is much cheaper solar panels and wind turbines, but also lots and lots of batteries. We're not there anywhere close to there. We need to spend a lot more on 4th generation nuclear, on fusion, on all these other technologies that potentially could come through. But the point is, research and development is incredibly cheap. And that's why we can spend it on pretty much all of these things. And we just have to have one or a few of these technologies come through. And those are the ones that'll power the 21st century. So if you look at how much we've spent, in percent of GDP, it was about 8 cents per $100 in the 1980s, and since then it's been about 3 to 4 cents. So it's halved, not increased. And in 2015, at the Paris summit, there was another summit where Obama and Xi Jinping and the EU and many other people of goodwill actually said we had a tiny bit of influence in this. It was called the Breakthrough Initiative, where they actually promised to double spending in green energy R&D. And we did no such thing. Again, because everybody focuses on building a new wind turbine farm rather than spending more on R&D. Because the first thing you can get on the news for, and you can go and cut a ribbon, and it looks like you're really doing something. Whereas the other one, that's just funding scientists to do their thing, and maybe it won't work before 20 years. But we know it's the only way they'll actually fix climate change.
And the larger R&D investments in the 1980s, has they paid off?
So the reason why we did it in the 1980s was because of the second oil crisis, and everybody wanted to find something else than oil. One way you can say it paid off, but this is somewhat far down the line, was in the fracking revolution in the U.S. in the early 2000s. And remember, what fracking did for the world was essentially, a lot of people have very negative images of fracking, and there are real environmental problems with fracking, but fundamentally, fracking meant you can make gas much cheaper, and that meant that the U.S. switched massively from coal to gas. That by far has been the most important thing for reducing CO2, because gas emits about half as much CO2 as does coal per unit of energy. So it was really one of those things where you got cheaper and greener energy through innovation. It was not the intention back then. They wanted to find a different opportunity for oil, and they wanted to get rid of the dependency on Saudi Arabia, and the U.S. clearly did that. Europe should have done the same thing. We should have made sure China did the same thing. That would have dramatically reduced emissions. Now, this is not the full solution, because obviously natural gas is still a fossil fuel and it still emits CO2, only much less. But it would have been a great bridge fuel to a greener future, and most of the world, unfortunately, didn't do that.
You mentioned earlier that climate change is one of the problems humanity is facing. Many would say that it's the problem, the greatest problem. What if the mean temperature would rise not 2 degrees, but maybe 4 or 5 degrees? Wouldn't that be a disaster for humanity?
It would be a bigger. It would be a bigger challenge. Now, nobody.
Would it be manageable for us?
Well. I think so. Certainly that's what the climate economics tell us, but it would definitely be a bigger problem. Now, all studies show that we're going to reach, by the end of the century, about 3 degrees. And so I think it's realistic to say, well, what is the impact of 3 degrees? This is what climate economics has been working on for a very long time, for decades. And what they find is, if you look at all the costs and all the benefits, remember when you have global warming, you get more heat waves, but you also get fewer cold waves. That means you get more people dying from heat, but fewer people dying from cold. You need to include all of these things. If you include all of them, there's more disbenefits and benefits. That's why it's a problem. But what it turns out is the net cost is equivalent to losing somewhere between 2 and 3% of GDP by the end of the century. This is the estimate of the only climate economist to win the Nobel Prize, William Nordhaus, and another one of the most quoted climate economists in the world, Richard Tol, 2 meta-studies that try to take into account all of the studies. Remember, you very often hear the worst studies, because it's a little bit like, is egg dangerous for you or not? Is coffee dangerous for you? You don't hear the studies that don't say this dangerous. You hear the studies that say they are dangerous. And so you hear the very extreme scenarios. But if you actually take the meta-study and take all of the studies, and that's what they've done, you come up with 2 to 3%. Just to give you a sense of proportion, the UN estimate that by the end of the century, the average person in the world will be about 450% as rich as he or she is today. So a much, much better world. Because of climate change, it's going to feel like he or she is only 435% as rich. Now, that's a problem. It's obviously a problem that we didn't get to 450, but it's not the end of the world. It's a slightly less, much better world. And that's why I'm saying, and that's why the science, the climate economics science shows very clearly climate change is a problem, but it's not by any means the end of the world. And that's incredibly important, because obviously if climate was the only problem in the world, then we should be was the main problem that's going to kill us all, then obviously you should spend all of our money on that, and you should just forget about poverty and all the other things. But that's just not what the numbers tell us.
But can't you make the argument, and I know some people do, that the uncertainty of climate change are so big and the risks are so big, so it may cost a lot of money, but it's a cheap insurance for future generation. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, there are certainly a lot of people who make that argument. There's several things wrong with that argument. First of all, if you want to buy real insurance for the vast majority of humanity, it's about getting them out of poverty. Not only is that great for all the other things that we worry about, like disease and hunger and all these things, but it also means that they are much, much less vulnerable to climate disasters. If a hurricane hits Florida, a few people die and that's it. If the same hurricane hits Guatemala, it devastates their economy and thousands or even tens of thousands of people die. So the answer here is not to try to make hurricanes slightly less worse by the end of the century. The answer, of course, is to get Guatemalans out of poverty first. Now, again, I sympathize with the idea of saying, but we should also make sure we do something good for climate. So there's two problems with this. First of all, so far, for the last 30 years, pretty much all that we've gotten from climate policy is rich countries virtue signaling a little bit. We haven't cut very much. I mean, we've still seen the biggest amount of emissions from fossil fuels in the world was last year. It keeps going up. And the reality is that even though we talk a lot about it, most people, not surprisingly, because we would do exactly the same thing as we were poor, decide they'd rather not be poor than cutting their carbon emissions. So we have been focusing on the wrong ways to fix climate change. And I think it's very likely that if we keep on doing these poor policies, we're going to see more people voting for the likes of Donald Trump. I don't agree with a lot of the things that Donald Trump has done, but I think we're seeing that also in a lot of Europe, right-wing populist parties that are essentially saying, enough, we don't want to pay for this. And remember, these current climate policies have to be endured for decades on end, and most likely, most of them will be scrapped at one point or another. So instead, we need to spend less, but spend it much smarter and dramatically increase research and green energy R&D, which would be much cheaper, much more effective, and also leave money for all the other problems that we should be fixing.
Right. Emissions is going up, that is true, but it's in many countries they are going down or they're not going up, and still we are getting more people and we are getting richer, so per capita the emissions are falling in some countries. Isn't that a little bit good?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'd rather live in a world where we cut emissions than where we don't. But there are real trade-offs, and that's what we've spent the last, half hour, 3/4 of an hour talking about, because we can't do it all. So we can decide we're going to spend a significant part of our wealth on cutting emissions. Now, in a rich country like Sweden, you can decide to do that, and you can get away with it, and you can do this for a fairly long time. But there are also powers that eventually, turn up and say, especially when this hurts a lot of poor people, because it will, poor people in rich countries, so poor people in Sweden, who feel the struggle from having to pay an expensive energy bill, who can't fill their gas tank, so on. Those are real issues, and eventually that'll turn up at the ballot box. But this is much, much more important to realize you can't make India or Africa or Indonesia decide to say this. It was somewhat underreported, but I don't know if you noticed, during the Brazil leadership of the latest climate conference, Lula also announced that they were going to drill a lot more off the coast of the Amazon forest. And, they were sort of challenging him and saying, but Mr. President, you're head of the climate conference, and you want everyone to cut. And he was like, yeah, but we're a poor country, and we also want to have more opportunity. We want to get a lot more people out of poverty, and that's just how it has to be. And that's, of course, obvious. I mean, we've recognized this because if you and I lived there, especially if we were poor, we would want our president to do the same thing.
Most of climate politics are ineffective and bad. Are there examples of good policies that we should do more of?
So, unfortunately, there has not been very many. I mean, there was a big study a couple of years ago that looked at 4,000 climate policies, and only 0.67%, so less than 1% of them had measurable impact. So what that tells you is, no, most of them have just been really, really bad. This doesn't mean that. So I think some of these things that we do for other reasons, so for air pollution reasons, for instance, getting rid of coal is a great idea in much of the rich world, not mainly because of climate change, but because they pollute a lot. And because we're rich, that is actually a really bad idea because they kill people from air pollution. There's also the argument of getting more energy efficiency. It's been good for many countries who didn't go on the fracking revolution, so are dependent on having to import a lot of fossil fuels. It's good, all things equal, that you don't have to import as much fossil fuels so that you save on energy. But unfortunately, no, many of these policies have just been, just breaking even or worse than that.
The plans for emission trading system in the EU, is that a good idea?
So it's certainly a better idea than most of these other tendencies that we want to give subsidies or that we want to just determine how to do this. Because if you do it through a trading system or a carbon tax, which is essentially the equivalent, you get a more efficient allocation. So any economist would say this is an improvement. But again, when you're going to say by 2040 we want to cut 90% of our emissions, that's just ludicrous. It's not going to happen at current technology. I mean, it may be that we find technologies that are so efficient that we can achieve this, but otherwise you're just going to get wholesale voter outrage and you're going to get these policies thrown out. That's part of the reason why I'm saying, we can promise all these nice things, but once it starts getting really, really expensive, voters won't have it. And so again, we need to find a policy that actually works in real life and not just one that makes especially green voters feel good right now.
And these great promises that are never going to be met, when it comes to democracy and what do you think about this political system and so on, are there risks and dangers that people are going, the promises are never met, so they are losing faith in politics?
Oh, of course. I mean, it's a bad idea to have politicians promise stuff that they're not actually going to achieve. That was true when we talked about the Sustainable Development Goals. That's true about the climate policies. But I think whereas most politicians probably knew that they were just bragging with the Sustainable Development Goals because they kind of knew, of course, we're not going to eradicate poverty and eradicate hunger and eradicate infectious disease. That's just silly to make these promises. What we should have promised, like we did in the Millennium Development Goals, to cut them by 2/3 or cut them by half or something realistic, that would have been sensible. The other thing is just propaganda. But I think on climate, a lot of people have bought in, a lot of politicians have bought in, this is the end of the world, so we just have to do everything. But of course, when it comes down to it, for most people, it is a problem, but it's also a problem if I can't afford to fill up my gas tank in the car or afford to keep the whole house heated. We know, for instance, in many countries, probably not so much here in Sweden because we have a fairly equal society, but in Britain, for instance, about 1/3 of all retirees, they keep parts of their house unheated in the winter because they just can't afford to, and many of them stay in bed longer in order to stay warm. Those kinds of things are just that's not how a civilized and developed country should be, and we need to come to terms with saying we shouldn't offer everything on the altar of climate change in order to do ineffective policies. We should be focusing on spending less money much more effectively so we both fix climate and fix all the other problems.
A bit on that topic, you argue in another of your pieces from last year that voters has grown tired of politicians who compete to scream the most and loudest about the imminent danger. And that's a good thing, I reckon.
Yes. Yes. I mean, look, we got to stop scaring our kids witless. As I mentioned, the fact that by the end of the century, the average person will only be 435% as rich rather than 450%. Should mostly be celebrated. I mean, yes, it's still a problem that we could have done even better. And yes, there's a lot of things in there, but this is not the end of the world. Us scaring kids witless has been a terrible thing. It's led to a lot of psychological problems, and quite frankly, I understand a lot of kids who've decided, no, I don't want to go to school, or I don't want to get a kid. Those are terrible outcomes if they're untrue, and I think it's very, very obvious. The data tells you these are untrue. So when we get politicians who scream a little less and who start having a more sensible conversation, yes, climate change is one challenge that we need to fix. Let's fix it smartly so we can also afford all the other things. Remember, for most Europeans, we've started realizing, we got to pay a lot more for our defense because there's actually real problems in the world that could come and bite us in the behind in just a couple of years. And there are lots of other problems across the European continent. We're not competitive enough. We have very, very high energy prices, which is one of the outcomes of climate policy. And we have unfunded, not here in Sweden, in the Nordics, but in general, unfunded pension systems that are going to erupt really badly in just a couple of decades. We have lots of other problems. Let's not make ourselves so weak for one thing that doesn't work, namely the current climate policies, that we can't actually fix all these other things. So we can also, stand up to Trump.
Another question, maybe a bit of a side note, but in Sweden for a few years ago, it was a very common message from politicians that you didn't have to choose between economic growth and climate transition because they were walking hand in hand. Actually, there was green transition was in itself a path to growth.
Yeah.
Was this never true, or was it true? Or
I don't think it was ever true, but it's very obvious now that we can see it's not true. Obviously, if
you recognize this,
yes, of course, and the simple point is, look, if green was really cheaper, everyone would just be doing it. This is not a hard thing to think about. If getting on the green wave was just something everyone wanted to do, we didn't need to have any climate summits. Everyone would just be doing it. The reason why we have to twist each other's arms and our own arms is, of course, that we're actually asking people to do, I'm sorry, would you mind having more expensive electricity, but at least it'll not be, you can't be confident that it'll be there when you need it. That's just a terrible argument. And of course, you can do this. Economists will always tell you with enough money, you can do whatever you want, but you just can't do everything. And so this costs real resources. And that's, of course, why we're seeing across the European continent a lot of people saying, no, I don't want to do this anymore. I think it's a tragic outcome of well-intentioned policy. So I think all of the green people who are arguing we should do something about climate change, they're well-intentioned. I mean, just like the people who are saying we should do something about education in the developing world, or the people who are saying we should get rid of malaria, they're all well-intentioned people. It just so happens that the well-intentioned people on climate change have been pushing a policy that we knew 30 years ago wouldn't work, that we knew 20 or 10 years or 5 years ago wouldn't work. And now most people can see, it was really expensive and didn't work very well. And most people are going to say no to this. So let's find a smarter and cheaper and more effective way to deal with climate change so we can do the exact same thing that we talked about in the beginning of the program, namely being smart and effective on all the different things that we need to worry about.
Our time is almost up, but just a few questions more. Are you familiar with the Swedish term åsiktskorridoren?
Oh, yes. I love that term. I don't know how to translate it, but it's a great term. I love to sort of translate it when I tell other people.
Has it been a real thing when it comes to climate politics?
Well, certainly where I've experienced it, I haven't been all that much involved in Swedish politics, but this is all over the place. Everybody has been for a very long time saying, no, you can't say anything but climate is the end of the world and we need to do everything about it. So even though I've never denied climate change, I've always said, yes, it's a real problem. It's a man-made problem. It's something that we need to fix, but it's not the only. Oh, wait. You're a terrible person, right? I mean, this was literally the reaction for a very long time. It is no longer. And I think part of this is because we started realizing, he's right, but also because it has become much more common, like Bill Gates and many others, to say, wait a minute, we actually also have other problems. And I think the invasion of Ukraine, COVID, have also made it clear to people, wait, we were not, we had this idea back in when the wall fell and the whole world seemed to have all come around at a sort of Western liberal democracy kind of thing. We thought history had ended. And, we really just had this one problem. We need to fix climate change. Sure, it's going to be expensive, but we can afford it. And it's really the only thing we need to fix. Now everyone realizes, wait, there's a lot of other issues, pension reforms, defense, the fact that we have so many other problems in the world that we need to tackle, make it much clearer to most people we have to be really careful how we spend our money.
So you and people who think like you are the winners. You're starting to win now. Can you put it like that?
No, I don't think that's the right way to think about it. Is much more that I think most people were in a sort of idealistic scenario for some decades and believing, we can do all good things. And we're all coming back to reality. I'm glad that we're all doing that. So I think it's more sort of welcome back to reality. Now let's try to think about this smartly instead of just ideologically. Let's do this in a cost-effective way rather than just wasting lots of resources on doing almost no good.
Mm. Looking back at the history of the debate on climate, are there any topics where you personally have changed your position?
Not on climate. No, I mean, I've always tried to look at the latest evidence. So one of the things, I'm going to give you an example that just shows you I was more right. So that's not a very good answer. So I think the fundamental point has always been that, yes, there is a climate problem, but no, it's not going to be the end of the world. And that's been my sort of basic argument. And most of the climate policies that we can enact will have fairly high cost, but deliver very little only in 100 years. Those are simple, basic outcomes of the way the climate works. And I think that's also why this has not been challenged in 20 or 30 years, because this was what the climate economists, William Nordhaus, who got the Nobel Prize in climate economics, he built the first models back in the early 80s, 1980s. And this was what the model showed back then, and we knew this. So I think much more, no, we were just in slightly la-la land for 30 years, and now we've come back to reality.
Welcome back from la-la land. We covered quite a few topics, obviously not all of them. Are there anything specific you would like to add to the listeners to summarize or anything extra?
So I think we end up, and I love the fact that we talked so much about the poor part of the world in this podcast, but we always end up, because we live in the rich world, we end up talking about climate change because that's what takes up a lot more space in a rich world setting. But I think it is important to recognize that about half this world's population, so about 4 billion people, live in low and lower middle income countries, where the world is just unrecognizable to the immense luxury we live in, and so it is worth sometimes taking a step back and realizing, oh my God, we have it well. Our lives are good. And while it's great that we are also worried about climate change and all these other things, let's just remember that there are really, really big and very basic problems for the majority of humanity. And these are problems that we can solve at very, very low cost. So I encourage you to go to our website, CopenhagenConsensus.com. You can actually download that one-pager so you can see what the 12 solutions are. And it's incredibly cheap. And what I would hope is that we can push our politicians to do a little more to make this world a much, much better place, especially for the people who are not at all where we are.
Thank you for that summary, and thank you so much for joining me today, Bjørn Lomborg.
Thank you.
Och stort tack också förstås till er som har lyssnat. Och stort tack för att ni stod ut med min engelska också. Det ni har lyssnat på, det är Ledarredaktionen, en podd från Svenska Dagbladet. Som vanligt är ni varmt välkomna att höra av er till oss på redaktionen med tankar och synpunkter på det vi har precis diskuterat. Antar att det finns en hel del tankar efter Björns utläggningar. Men också om ni har idéer och förslag på ämnen vi ska ta upp i framtiden. Maila då till ledarsidan@svd.se. Dagens producent, han heter Jesper Sandström. Ansvarig utgivare är Lisa Irenius. Själv heter jag Andreas Ericson och jag hoppas att vi hörs snart igen.